Welcome to Rated. In this series, I rate the individual studio albums of my favorite prog rock artists and bands. For this episode, I will be rating the studio albums of one of my favorite solo artists, Peter Gabriel. Now, being born in the 80s, I was first familiar with Peter Gabriel as a solo artist before I even knew that he fronted Genesis during their early days. In my opinion, he never put out a bad album. Although his albums may not be as progressive as his albums with Genesis, they really show the true talent of his craft, making it understandable why he left the band. He needed to further develop his own style and sound, which continually evolves to this day. That, to me, is the hallmark of a great artist. The following is the rating system I will be using. 1 star means the album is abysmal, to avoid at all costs, and is for completionists only. 2 stars is poor, not up to the usual standard of the band or artist. 3 stars, it's good, solid, worth checking out, not their best, not their worst. 4 stars is great, very strong, highly recommended. And then finally, 5 stars is an excellent album, which I consider classic and is required listening. I will rate each of his 9 studio albums only in chronological order. I will not be covering his excellent soundtrack or live albums in this video. Please keep in mind these are merely my own personal opinions. Music is very subjective and I respect everyone's unique opinions. With that in mind, let's kick things off with his debut album.
Climbing up on Salisbury Hill, I could see the city light. Wind was blowing, time stood still. Eagle flew out of the night. He was something to observe. Came in close, I heard a voice.
I think his first album is excellent and a classic in my opinion. It is very diverse sounding, which may deter some, however, I believe it's a strength in this case. It goes from mysterious prog sounding, to folk, to straight up rock, to barbershop quartet, to blues, all in a single album. The common denominator, in my opinion, is the quality of craftsmanship that goes into his songs both lyrically and musically. Perhaps he has something to prove. Regardless, with this album, you can clearly see why he left Genesis and went out on his own. The absolutely stunning track Salisbury Hill is partially about his decision to leave the band. He has been quoted saying the following about the track. It's about being prepared to lose what you have for what you might get. It's about letting go. Robert Fripp of King Crimson plays guitar on this album, as well as future King Crimson bassist Tony Levin.
On the air, on the air, on the air. Every morning I'm at the dawn with a 12-cent tramp. A silent communion in front of all by the sodium lamps.
His second self-titled album is great and is certainly more consistent sounding compared to his first album. That being said, I still prefer his prior album to this one. Nonetheless, it's a great album with a lot of very solid material. It starts to lose me slightly during the middle of side 2, but the stronger material on the album more than makes up for this. Robert Fripp produced this album, and his influence is very present, especially on the track Exposure, which he co-wrote with Gabriel. I wouldn't recommend this as a starting point for checking out Peter Gabriel, but it is certainly a must-have for any fan. Also, I have found it's one of the albums that doesn't show all of its cards at once. It's one that requires repeated listens, in my opinion, to fully appreciate it. On original LP pressings of the album, the audio track of White Shadow, which was the last song on side 1, continued into a locked groove.
Whistling tunes, we piss on the girls in the jungle. It's a knockout. If looks could kill, they probably will. In games without frontiers, war without tears. If looks could kill, they probably will. In games without frontiers, war all without tears.
Everything seemed to click and come together with Peter Gabriel's third self-titled album. I can honestly say this is my favorite of his and consider it a classic album. The sound is a combination of new wave and art rock. He matched the sound to his lyrical themes perfectly. Just take the album opener Intruder, for example, with its unsettled theme and music. For me, this is the album when he perfected his songwriting craft. He also explored more political material with two of his most famous songs, the anti-war song, Games Without Frontiers, and the protest song, Biko, which remembered the murdered activist Stephen Biko. I know he would go on to have more popular songs and albums, however to me, this will always be his masterpiece. Gabriel's ex-bandmate Phil Collins, who succeeded him as Genesis's lead vocalist, plays drums on several of the album's tracks. The track Intruder has been cited as the first use of Collins's gated drum sound. With his fourth album, it saw Peter Gabriel expanding on the world music influence first hinted at on his prior album. The darkness that was apparent on his last album has been alleviated somewhat and has a brighter feel, even though the material can still be somber at times. I think this is partially due to Gabriel's dabbling in African and Latin rhythms. It is a very powerful album with each song setting a very specific atmosphere. It does not grab you immediately, however, is very rewarding with repeated listens. Take the song San Jacinto, for example. It didn't do much for me at first, but now it's one of my favorites of his off the album. This is a great album with classic material that should not be overlooked. As with his previous three albums, the album is titled Peter Gabriel. In the United States and Canada, Geffen Records issued the album under the title Security to differentiate it from his previous releases.
Just let the red rain splash you. Let the rain fall on your skin. I come to you, defenses down, with the trust of a child.
Peter Gabriel's first non-self-titled studio album, So, is certainly his most popular and successful. It is with this album that Peter Gabriel went from a cult artist to the mainstream. The material on here is less experimental and more commercial than his prior albums. It's a very good album. Personally, I'm not a fan of some of the overtly commercial sound, combined with the 80s production. Also, a few of the songs don't really do much for me, such as Don't Give Up and Mercy Street. I don't dislike them, they just don't resonate with me. Overall, there is an increased focus on melody combined with African and soul music. This works very well, especially on the tracks In Your Eyes and Sledgehammer, which are two of his most celebrated songs. The track, We Do What We're Told, Milgram's 37, references the experiment on obedience carried out by American social psychologist Stanley Milgram, intended as a reference to the obedient citizens show to dictators during times of war.
Down by the roadside, a secret world we were colliding. In all the places we were hiding love. What was it we were thinking of?
This is a very good album in a similar vein as his prior album, So, although this one is a little bit more focused and cohesive. Gabriel focused on personal themes on Us, including his divorce in the late 80s, his subsequent relationship, and the growing distance between him and his first daughter. The production is very clean and pristine. The songs themselves are very subtle for the most part. Overall, it is understated and reflective in nature, meaning that repeated listens are a must to fully unearth all of its magic. That isn't to say there aren't any songs that grab you immediately. There are a few of those for sure. As with his last album, not all of it resonates with me. However, enough of it does to make it a solid, good album. Definitely worth checking out. Led Zeppelin's John Paul Jones plays bass, keyboard, and surdo on the track 14 Black Paintings.
When I allow it to be, there's no control over me. I have my fears.
This is one of his most dense albums that takes time to unpack its genius. It's certainly not as immediate or as accessible as his prior Us or So albums. However, that's okay for me. I enjoy music that has depth and takes time to reveal itself. This is a perfect example of such an album. When I first listened to it, I liked it. However, it took me a little bit to discover its true magic. However, now I see each of these 10 tracks as its own finely crafted masterpiece. It's not for the faint of heart, considering the song's topics deal with birth and especially death. Fans of his more poppy sound will probably not love it. I never tire of this album, along with its first and third albums, which is why I gave it 5 stars. And perhaps for me, it is the time in my life when the album came out. It was an exciting time. I was just starting college, and it resonated with me then, just as it does now, almost 20 years later. This album is Peter Gabriel's last full-length studio album of new original material to date, as his subsequent albums feature covers of other artists' songs or orchestral renderings of his own older material.
But I love it when you sing to me, and you can sing me anything.
This is a very interesting covers album. It is Peter Gabriel's vocals backed by an orchestra. As expected with these types of arrangements, the music overall is stark and sober with a hint of melancholy. This is a very unique approach that serves most of the songs beautifully. He really makes his own mark on these songs by other artists. When it works, it is very powerful and moving. Take his cover of David Bowie's Heroes, for example. I also admire the diversity of the artists and songs he chose to cover. Out of the dozen songs, half are from older artists such as Paul Simon, Neil Young, Lou Reed, and Randy Newman, while the other half are from more contemporary artists like Arcade Fire, Radiohead, and the Magnetic Fields. Overall, I think this is a very good album worth checking out. The idea behind the Scratch My Back project is a song exchange where each artist would cover one of Gabriel's songs in return for his covering one of theirs. The other artists' rendition of Gabriel's songs appear on the 2013 album entitled And I'll Scratch Yours.
Yellow eagle flies down from the sun, from the sun.
With this album, Peter Gabriel revisited his own material and gave it a similar voice and orchestral treatment that he did on his prior album, Scratch My Back. With that being said, he selected his material that would work best in this format. For example, there's no Sledgehammer or Big Time, which makes perfect sense here. Instead of focusing on hits, he chose songs that would benefit the most from this treatment. For example, the dramatic reworking of San Jacinto and Intruder give these songs new life, which, based on the album's title, is the point, I think. It's a very good album that any Peter Gabriel fan should check out to hear a different twist on some of his classic songs. The album features a new song called A Quiet Moment, which originated in Gabriel's desire to separate Salisbury Hill, which was included due to huge demand, from the rest of the album. So, to recap, the following are the ratings I assigned to each album. Like I said before, in my opinion, he never really put out a bad album. Even the albums I don't like as much have great material on them. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention his fabulous soundtrack albums. In particular, his 1989 album Passion, which is the soundtrack for the film The Last Temptation of Christ. It is instrumental and is considered a landmark for popularizing world music. Some of his best musical ideas are on this album, in my opinion. It is highly recommended. Also, out of all his live albums, the one I would recommend would be Plays Live from 1983. Recorded during the tour of his fourth album, this contains a great selection of songs from his first 4 albums, plus the infectious, previously unreleased song I Go Swimming. Definitely worth checking out. As always, thank you very much for watching.